In this lecture, we are going to look at Hispanic American culture. And unfortunately, just due to the time constraints of the class, this will be the only week we spend on this culture. And what we're going to focus on this is even just this idea of what does Hispanic American culture mean? When I say that, what are we talking about? And that's part of the problem with this identity. It's really not even a true identity. We're taking people from Latin based countries and we are putting them all together into one group, which robs many people of their actual identity. And that's what I want you to keep in mind as we look at this section. And we're going to look at this struggle through the works of individuals such as Gloria Anzalda and briefly Frida Kahlo. I had you read the selection How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzalda. This was written in 1987. It was part of her larger work, La Fortuna. And what happens, what you're going to see here is we're looking at themes of finding their own identity. And Gloria Anzalda is looking at what's called Chicano or Chicana culture. The term Chicano was originally used by both Mexicans and Americans to refer to individuals who were mixed, Mexican Americans of the lower classes. By 1960s, though, the term was then re-embraced by this culture, the Chicana culture, as a point of pride. It was saying, well, there's nothing wrong with us just because we're mixed, and so we're going to take this and we're going to accept that as our identity. By 1987, two more terms were added, Chicana, which means Mexican American women, and mestiza. Mestiza refers to a mixed race, and this was describing a Chicana woman who were especially concerned with the heritage that was both Mexican and Native American. Anzalda emerged as a pioneer in both the writing and study of Chicana literature. She was born to ranchers in Jesus Maria of the Valley, Texas. She earned her bachelor's from Pan American University in 1969 and her master's from the University of Texas in Austin in 1973. She did other graduate studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and she taught creative writing and Chicano studies and feminist studies at various universities. Her goal was to help introduce young readers to important figures in Chicana culture, but to also help reshape how Chicano women were seen. And she said there was either a duality. They were either seen as the virgin or the whore. And she said in Mexican culture, there tends to be three main representations of women. The first is La Virgen de Guadalupe, which references the Virgin Mary. The second is La Chiquinda, or the raped one, referring to an Aztec princess who served as Cortez' translator and lover. And the third was La Llorona, the woman who cries. And this was a spurned Mexican mistress who drowned her children. And so what she wanted to do was she wanted to try to show that there are other avenues for Mexican American, Hispanic American women. At the core of Anzalda's work is the belief that because metaphors structure the way we think, the metaphorical influence of these types of women must be reshaped so that Chicanos can escape the binary constraints of being judged as either a virgin or a whore. And interestingly enough, in many of her works, you also see this struggle of finding her own identity. Many of her works are written in English, but she also writes in Spanish, often mixing the two and offering no translation. And part of that is saying, well, why should she? Anzalda herself spoke both English and Spanish, and often a mixture of it. And she chose not to add translations because why should she have to translate? Why should others not have to learn her language? And this is what you're going to see in How to Tame a Wild Tongue from Borderlands or La Fontana. This was published in 1999. The version you have, I'm sorry. And she says with this, when she's talking about how do you tame a wild tongue, and I think it. How do you tame a wild tongue? Train it to be quiet. How do you bridle and saddle it? And so here what she's talking about some of her own personal experiences of struggling with almost this dual identity that she had. On one side, she was not seen as Mexican. On the other side, she was not seen as American, and that she was something mixed. And so this tale talks a lot about her struggles growing up and dealing with this. As we go through this, I'm not going to explain all of it to you, but I will raise some questions that I want you to think about in your reading. And so we begin, she's talking about speaking Spanish at school. And remember, at first she got in trouble for speaking it on the playground. And then when she tried to correct her teacher for mispronouncing her name, think about what happens. And Zalda actually got in trouble for talking back to the teacher. And think about, this is your name. If somebody says your name wrong, that is part of your identity. And if you as a young child get in trouble when you're even trying to correct somebody in your own name, it teaches you that maybe even what you know about your name is incorrect. Often she was told to speak American, and if she didn't like it, to go back to Mexico where she belonged. Remember, she was born in Texas. She is an American citizen. And think of that in today's day and age when you hear people like, we're in the United States, speak English. There is no official language of the United States. Her mother would always tell her also when she was little that she needed to find a good job, and to find a good job, you had to speak English well. And she would say, what good is your education if you still speak English with an accent? And this refers to her experience when she was at Pan American University. Remember, she talked about that she had to take 2 speech classes. Why? Because she needed to get rid of her accent. She says she remembers growing up that well-bred girls did not gossip or talk too much. They did not talk back to their parents. And anybody who was successful also didn't speak with an accent. And that's an interesting concept to think about. Here, when you hear somebody speaking with an accent, what are some conclusions that people come to? Sadly, it may be that these individuals aren't intelligent, and that's not fair. Think of how many of us actually speak more than one language. In many countries, especially in European countries, multiple languages are part of the general education. And in fact, in the United States, this idea that you only need to know one language is a rarity. Those who speak multiple languages have a different level and skill set than others. Yet when you speak one language maybe at more of an elementary level or not quite as fluent, you're often looked down as being dumb or less intellectual. Again, in Zalda was very shocked when she thinks about the roles of women. She says she had never heard the term nosotros before, which is the feminine form of we in Spanish, that it was always nosotros, which is the male form. And she said she was very shocked when she heard it, because that women, she thought, didn't even have an identity. They were only identified as the masculine we. And she said of this, they were robbed of being female because of masculine plural. And so this nosotros made it so that these women actually had a group identity. She also talks about those who spoke just the Spanish language claimed that those who are now speaking English are mutilating the language. And she had that same thing when she was speaking English. She was told she was not speaking correct English. And often the Chicano Spanish is considered a mutilation of Spanish. However, she says that it is not incorrect, but it's a natural development of the people living on the border between Mexico and the United States. She claims the Chicano language is a living language, a new language that's developed and corresponds to a way of living, that it represents those people and there's nothing wrong with it. She says it's the language of those people who are neither Spanish nor live in a country in which Spanish is the first language. For people who live in a country in which English is the reigning tongue but who are not Anglo. For people who cannot entirely identify with either standard. What recourse is left for them but to create their own language? And with language, she says it's neither Espanol nor English, but both. We speak peitos, a forked tongue, a variation of 2 tongues. And she claims the language needed to develop to help these people form their own distinct identity. And again, she calls this language their homeland. And what does she mean by this? This is something I want you to think about. What does she mean by saying that the language was their homeland? And then she talks about, on page 2707, she talks about this idea of poco, P-O-C-H-O. And it's this idea that you're a cultural traitor, that you're speaking the oppressor's language by speaking English, yet at the same time, she's criticized for speaking Spanish incorrectly. And then as we go through the reading, things I want you to also think about. this idea of linguistic terrorism. And she says that they are looked at as foul-mouthed, the deficient Spanish, and claims that linguistically they're orphans. And so they grew up believing they spoke poor Spanish or they spoke poor English. And then different things I want you to think about as you go along. She talks about this idea of how language is kept alive. And think about that. Latin is what we consider a dead language. It's because it's no longer spoken. It's not the tongue of any group of people. And so to keep the Chicano language alive, it needs to be spoken. And then she claims, if you want to really hurt me, talk badly about my language. Why? Because she claims she is her language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Why? Because how we speak, right? We grow up, we learn to speak listening to others, listening to those we grow up with. And to try to deny that or to say that is wrong is in some way fundamentally saying that we ourselves are wrong. Okay? All right, other things that she talks about here that I want you to look at. She talks about writings, and think about that first time she felt that Chicanos really existed as a people. And this was when she read her language in print in a novel. Also the movies, going to see the movies with her family. And she said at once she has a feeling of homecoming and alienation from this. And I want you to think about that idea. And then also the music, listening to the corridos. These were songs of love and death, usually from the Texas-Mexican borderland, usually about Mexican heroes who do valiant deeds against the Anglo oppressors. And with these, she said she had a sense of shame that she was listening to them, but then she also found that she didn't want to stop. And then even this idea of food, the food and smell. I mean, and think about this. She said with this identified her homeland. And think about it. When you've been away from home for a while, or if you've moved away, when you go back home, what's one of the first things you want to do? Usually you want your favorite meal, right? And then think of home. Think of the smells of home. And what do you think of? Probably it has something to do with the food. And the food we eat when we're home, right, it's this different sense of identity. Because what is home? Home is this place where we feel we belong, where we can be our true selves. And again, that goes with this idea of identity. All of these things that she felt as if the world was making her choose helped structure her identity. And she at the end says, this is not something I have to choose. She calls it the borderline conflict. And what happens is when you choose, you have to choose one side until they each become nothing. And so she's decided that she herself, right, and the Chicano people need to accept both sides, and that's who they are. She asserts that the Chicano people in 1965 knew they were a people when they began to organize together and became aware of their reality as people. But the struggle for identity continues, and she's sure, though, that they will survive because they will fight. Okay? She claims the Chicanos will survive. They did not give up their tongue, meaning their language. Yet possessing a malleability that renders us unbreakable, we, the mestizas and mestizos, will remain.